G'day and welcome to another video with BetterPix. Hope this finds everyone well. Today I just wanted to talk about using adjustment layers within Photoshop. Adjustment layers is a really powerful tool and something that I use quite extensively. And when it's required, it really does come in handy. And there's a couple of ways that you can actually use those adjustment layers. The nice thing about them is that, as the name suggests, the layer is on top of the image, which means it's a non-destructive method of working. So you're not actually applying the adjustment to the image, you're applying the adjustment above the image. Now that might be a little bit hard to understand at this stage, but we'll certainly go through what all of that means, and we'll have a look at some options at how you can use adjustment layers. Okay, so as you can see, I've got an image here. I photographed this image in Antarctica, and it's of a cute little chin strap penguin, just on a little rocky outcrop, and you can see that it was actually snowing at the time. Those thankfully are not dust particles on my image. It is actually snowflakes falling at the time. So yeah, it certainly is a good thing that I don't have that amount of dust or marks or blemishes on my image to clean up, because that would take a long time. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is make sure that our adjustments panel is open. So the adjustments panel basically are a whole set of tools or different adjustments that you can apply to image, and when you apply those tools, it applies it as a layer over the top of your image, which I'll go into a little bit deeper in a moment. So if you can't see that adjustments panel, you just need to head up to Window, come down to Adjustments, and click on that one so that you have it ticked. So if I click on that one, you can see it disappears, and I'll click on that again, and there it is again. So you just want to make sure that that is ticked so that we do have access to those tools. So one of the first things that I want to do with this image is just to slightly darken the outside of the image. I'm happy with how I shot this image, the exposure and everything. I've done some very light adjustments in the Camera Raw converter before opening this image into Photoshop. But I just want to bring the brightness levels or the exposure down a little bit around the outside of this image, so that the focus stays on the subject, which is obviously the penguin in the middle of the frame. So what that means is I'm going to reduce the exposure of the entire image, and then I'm going to selectively remove that reduction and exposure from where the penguin is, so that the exposure goes back to its original. So if we come across, we can see we've got add an adjustment. Now within that adjustment layer toolset, you can see we've got a lot of options. So we're just going to very quickly go through them. The first one, if you hover over it, you can see it actually gives you the title or the name of the adjustment that's up the top there. First one, brightness and contrast, pretty self-explanatory. The next one is levels. The next one is curves. The next one is exposure. The next one is vibrance, hue saturation, color balance, black and white, photo filter, channel mixer, color lookup, invert, posterize, threshold, selective color, and gradient map. Now, what I find for most people is that they don't use all of them. There's usually only a select few tools that people tend to use, which is totally fine. So I'm going to show you a couple of options today, and really the best tools for you to use and experiment with are the ones that are going to give you the effect that you want. So my recommendation is to always experiment with all of them, and then you'll start to learn what each of them does, and you can go for the one that gives you the results you're after. Alright, so there's a couple of ways that we can reduce the exposure of a particular image. The first one that we're going to look at is the curves. Now if I click on that one, you can see down here in our layers panel, the background, which is the penguin. The next one above is curves, which is the layer that I've just clicked on, and you can see it literally is a layer above the background. If I click on it again, it creates another one and aptly names it Curves 1, Curves 2. So if you're needing extra curves adjustments or extra layers or extra adjustments, if I click, for example, on the levels, it's going to give us a levels adjustment layer. If I click on another one, it's going to give me another levels adjustment layer, always applying that layer above the last one that you were active on. Now, I just want to use one curves layer for now, so if I select those top three and just click and drag them down to the rubbish bin, it will actually get rid of them. So that's handy to know that if you accidentally apply an adjustment layer that you don't want to use, or if you want to get rid of one that you've been using, you just need to drag it down to that rubbish bin and it'll be gone. The other option is you can actually turn off the visibility of the layer. So if I click on that little icon to the left of the curves layer there, you can see that it turns it on and off. And say for example I make an adjustment, I'll just make a very quick adjustment, making the image darker. I can turn that off and on as I see fit. What I can also do, I'll just make another curves adjustment very similar, turn that on, is I can adjust the opacity. So the opacity is literally the amount with which that adjustment has been applied. So it's anywhere between 0 and 100%, 100% being a maximum application, and I can adjust how much that adjustment layer appears above the image, which in this case is the background. Now you can see that this already gives us an incredible amount of control over how that adjustment layer is applied to a particular image. But what I want to demonstrate today mostly is what happens if you only want to apply that adjustment layer to certain parts of the image. Those adjustments that we've looked at so far are equal application to the entire image, but we may only want some of it to appear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a small curves adjustment so that the image is a little bit darker, and I'm just going to reduce that tab so that we're not looking at it. That way we can see the entirety of the image. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this video, what I want to do is just have the outer edges of the image darkened a little bit. But you can see with that curves layer, if I turn that off and on, it's applied that darkening evenly across the entire image. Now, the good thing about this method or workflow is we have what's called a mask, and that's, you can see there as I hover over it, layer mask thumbnail. That little mask just there on the above the image there, which is indicated by a little white panel, basically shows where and how much of this adjustment is being applied above the image. Now, in conjunction with that layer mask and the paintbrush tool, which the shortcut is B, we can actually paint in certain parts of the image and remove that curves adjustment or add to that curves adjustment. So I'm just going to increase the size of my brush tool. In fact, if I right click above the image, you can see you've got the size and hardness options there. The size is literally the size of the tool. The hardness is how hard the edges are. 0 means its maximum softness on the edges of the tool, and up to 100 is maximum hardness. So if I show you maximum hardness, you can see that it's a very defined circle. And if I go down to maximum softness over on the other side, it's a very soft transition between 100% application and no application at all. So I'm just going to remove those two adjustments that I just applied. Alright, so in this case I want to go with no hardness at all. I want a very soft transition between the application of the brush and no application of the brush. I'm also going to just increase the size of the brush a little bit because that will help with the softness and the application of the actual the brush itself. Now, in order for this tool to work, you need to make sure that your mask is selected. It's very easy to deselect the mask. You can see at that point where those little corners for the rectangular thing are. Sorry, my description isn't very good, but you can see that it's not actually selected on the mask at the moment. So we just need to make sure that mask is selected, otherwise the brush tool won't actually work. We also need the color of our brush to be selected as black. Now, black gives us 100% application of the brush tool, and that's generally what I use. So just keep that in mind. If, say for example, we select white, it's already white, so we can click and paint to our heart's content, nothing's going to happen. So in order for that brush tool to work at the moment, because our mask is white, we need to apply black, obviously the opposite of white. Now, if I just make one click and drag, you can see two things have happened. The brightness levels around the penguin where I've clicked and dragged with that tool have come back to what they were. And you can see down here on the layer mask that black has actually been applied in that area. So if you can imagine, the layer mask is an application of some sort of adjustment, and the black stops the application of that adjustment. In this case, we've made the image darker by applying some black onto that layer mask. It's removed that darkening, and we're seeing the original image underneath. Now, if I click that layer mask's visibility, now if I click that layer mask visibility on and off, you can see that the brightness of the penguin in the center where we've removed the adjustment is exactly the same. It's no different. But because we've allowed the adjustment to only come through around the outer edge, you can see that that outer edge, when I turn it on, that adjustment becomes visible and the outer edge becomes darker. Now, I've applied that brush with 100% opacity, which means anywhere that I click, it's going to apply that brush to the mask 100%. Now, if you want to have a little bit more of a refined, and I'm just going to remove those adjustments that I've made, so we go back to the beginning, you can see now the mask is completely white, so the adjustment is fully being applied to the image below. If I remove that, or if I reduce, that opacity down to 50%, it means that as I paint, only 50%, and you can see it's a grey sort of colour, of that brush is being applied to the mask. If I click again, it's going to apply 50% of that difference again. So not 50 plus 50 is 100, but 50% of 50%, if that makes sense. So what this means is you have another level of control. You have another level of finer refinement of how this adjustment or how this overall editing technique is being applied to your image. And if I just gently paint that into different parts of the image, making it very subtle, you can see that I've got complete control over how that adjustment is being applied to this image, which is far better than the original technique that I used where it was 100% with a hard edge. So you can see now the result that we have is far more natural looking. If you looked at that image straight off the bat, you would almost potentially see that image as that's how the lighting was. Now, it does look very natural, which is always the result, for me personally, that I'm going for. That's needless to say, not necessarily the approach that everybody wants to go for. You may want to go for a very harsh, obvious adjustment application to a particular image, but really think about what the outcome is that you want to go for and then adjust to suit. For me, this is a nature image and I want it to be as subtle and natural looking as possible. Now, those adjustments that I've made are very quick. I would probably go in and just do a little bit more refinement, maybe just a little bit of extra painting here and there. That's looking pretty good, just because I want the image to look as natural as possible, but obviously still with a darkening of the outer edges to bring that focus towards the animal or the subject in the middle. Now, if I turn that layer on and off, it's quite obvious, but just looking at the image itself, it's quite subtle, which is exactly, as I've said, the result that I'm going for. Now, say for example, if you've reached a point where you're happy with the image and you save the image, you can actually save it with that layer intact. And there's two file formats that you can save it, either a PSD or a TIFF. With a PSD, which is a Photoshop document, you can keep that layer active, and you can do the same with a TIFF as well. Now, keeping in mind, the image size will be quite huge, so it'll be a lot bigger than what it normally is. But it means that that layer is active, and you can come back and work on it a little bit more in the future if you want to refine the results that you're getting. Now, say for example, also during this editing session, if I think, okay, I actually want to make that darker again. Excellent, not a problem at all. All we need to do, because we've painted in black to reveal the image underneath that mask, we need to paint in white. And that's actually going to make the adjustment, which in this case was the darkening, appear a little bit more than what it was when we started or when we finished editing. That's going to make the adjustment that we've applied show through a little bit stronger. So in this case, the darkening of the image. And if you want to go back again, you can lighten the image again. This is complete non-destructive editing, and it's a great way to go. Now, this method of applying specific adjustments to specific areas of an image can be applied with all of those adjustments that I showed you earlier. For example, the other tool that you could use to darken the outside of an image is the brightness and contrast. So the brightness is another method of darkening or brightening an image. Again, we apply an adjustment brush and then paint in the areas that we don't want the layer to appear. And we achieve the same result. You can see that mask being updated as I paint on the bottom right hand side of my screen. So again, we're achieving just a slight darkening of the outside of the image. Let's say, for example, we want to apply another adjustment and we want to reduce some of the color towards the outside of the image. What I've done is just apply a black and white adjustment layer, and you can see that it's applied 100% to that image because it's now obviously fully black and white. Now what we can do is start by completely painting that mask to 100% so that we get back to a completely color image. You can see that mask down the bottom right hand corner is completely black, so none of that black and white adjustment is being applied to the image. Now if I use X to swap around my colors for my paintbrush, and I'm going to just reduce the opacity down to 20%. What this is going to do is I'm going to be able to just remove a little bit of the color around the outside or anywhere that I paint. And basically wherever I paint with this paintbrush with white selected, the black and white adjustment layer is going to start to show through. Now what I'm trying to do here is just remove a little bit of the color around the outside of the image, and you can see as I paint that in that the color intensity around the outside of the image is just reducing ever so slightly. The more I paint, the more that black and white comes through. Now that's been a progressive change, but if I turn that layer on and off, you can see how much of that color has been reduced. It's quite significant, isn't it? So again, for me, for nature images and the style of image editing that I like to go for, I like subtle changes that look natural. Again, your style of editing may be completely different, so the way that you use these tools is entirely up to you. Now, if say, for example, I'm editing that color out of the outer parts of the image and I start to think, well, actually, that's not the way that I want to go. All I need to do, as I showed you earlier, is click and drag that black and white layer down to the rubbish bin. The other option is you can simply turn it off in the meantime, just in case you want to revisit that layer as an option in the future. So now, that's completely fine. That's not going to affect the image at all. So from here, all we need to do is save the image. If we're saving it for web or email, then we can save it as a JPEG. If we want to save it for printing, then a TIFF or a PSD would be great, as they are non-compression files and you won't lose any of the quality. They also allow you, as I mentioned, to revisit the image and work on those adjustment layers if you would like to make further refinements. So with this brief introduction into layer masks and layer adjustments, you can see that you have an extreme amount of control over the various adjustment options that are available, not only in how you apply it to the whole image, but how you can apply it to specific areas of the image. This gives you a level of control that really does allow you to achieve results specific to your needs and specific to the outcome that you're hoping for. I hope this video has been helpful and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Take care.